You ever want to talk about a song, but the thing you want to talk about isn't the melody, isn't the harmony, isn't the chords, isn't the rhythm, isn't the lyrics, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? It's just something that you feel that you want to talk about. The thing that you may want to discuss is the song's texture. Let's talk about it.
Bloop boop boo. Bloop doop doo. Bloop doop da boo.
Hey, I'm Michael. I have a doctorate in music composition, and I taught music theory at 2 different universities for 6 years. One of my favorite topics to teach was texture. Since Ramin and I talked a lot about texture in our recent review of Sarah McLachlan's 1993 album Fumbling Towards Ecstasy, link for that in the description, I thought I would give that deeper dive into texture that I was promising in that video. Texture can kind of mean 2 different but slightly related things when we're talking about music. The meaning that you're most likely to find in theory textbooks has to do with the number of voices in a piece of music and how they interact with each other. When we say voices in music theory, we don't technically only mean the human voice. A voice in a music theory sense can be any single line of music. So a violin or a flute can play one voice, but a keyboard instrument can potentially play multiple voices at the same time. When there is only one voice, we call that texture monophonic. A piece of music in a monophonic texture can be performed by just a solo musician, or it can be performed by a large group of musicians or any number of musicians, as long as they are all performing the same line. Think of Gregorian chant by monks singing in Latin. But this also exists in more recent music. Check out Bjork's song, Show Me Forgiveness. When there are 2 or more voices, we have more options. Homophonic, heterophonic, and polyphonic. I think polyphonic is the easiest to understand of these 3, so I'll talk about that one first. Polyphonic is when there are 2 or more voices that have roughly equal importance. There's no lead voice and backup singers, for example. In this case, they're all leads. Polyphonic texture is not, I'm gonna sneeze. Polyphonic music is not very common in music from recent centuries. Think of Renaissance music with voices and instruments all doing their own thing. Like, it still sounds good together, but they are all meant to be playing their own thing. Homophonic and heterophonic textures both have a single predominant melody line, but it's what the other voices do in relation to them that changes that description. We don't really have heterophonic music in Western culture. Heterophonic music is when everyone has essentially the same melody line, the entire ensemble is playing the same thing, but they're all playing slight variations to it at the same time that give the whole texture sort of buzzing, warm feeling to it. I am not an expert in non-Western music, so if anyone can think of an example that I couldn't off the top of my head, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to listen to it. The vast majority of Western music, for a very long time, has been predominantly homophonic in texture. Homophonic is when we have a melody and less important harmonies. This can be anything from a singer accompanying themselves on guitar or piano, to a choir singing in 4-part harmony, to a rock band, to a pop song with lots of different synths in the DAW, to an orchestra of 80 people. As long as one voice has, or one group of voices has, the most important melody, and everyone else is playing something that's supporting them, it is homophonic. Now, this most important role can move from voice to voice, as long as at once there's only one that is most important. But that's not the only definition of texture when it comes to music. We could also be talking about orchestrational or surface texture. This is much less codified when talking about music, but you can basically use whatever words you want to try and describe what you're experiencing, and if you're good enough at explaining yourself, people will understand what you're talking about. Some common descriptors in this type of music might be thick versus thin. For example, a thick texture might have a lot of notes happening at once, while a thin texture would be more sparse and with fewer notes. We might say rough texture versus angular or smooth. A rough texture might have choppy, repeated notes or chords, while an angular texture might have lots of leaps all over the place in the melody, and then a smooth texture might be more stepwise motion, not a lot of leaps. We might say wet versus dry texture, and this is the one that I talk about the most usually. Wet in this case means reverberant, the pitches continue for longer, and a dry texture is crisp, where the notes don't ring out for as long. We might say dark versus bright texture. Most, but not all, instruments sound darker lower in their range and sound brighter higher in their range. Certain instruments just naturally sound darker all the time, like a bass clarinet, while other instruments just naturally sound brighter all the time, like an oboe. But most instruments can sound different in different parts of their range. If you watched our video on vocal color, some of this language might sound familiar to you. It's basically the same idea. Different things vibrate to make the sound. A string might vibrate, a reed might vibrate, and then there are different resonant bodies that carry that sound, like the inside of a guitar, or the pipes of a French horn, or the giant pipes of a big pipe organ. Then different overtones are more or less present depending on those factors and others, like, for example, the material that the instrument is made out of. Is it wood? Is it metal? You may notice throughout the rest of this video that I sometimes use texture, color, and timbre in very similar ways. They can mean very closely related things, and sometimes the boundary between these terms gets a little fuzzy, but they are different things. Timbre typically refers to the sound that an instrument or human voice makes. The color is... This is so hard to explain. The color is often the result of different things that the performer does to bring out different colors of the instrument's natural timbre. Color can also be used for a full ensemble, like we can say that woodwind quintet has a really dark color right here. But when we get to ensembles and color, that's where things kind of get muddy and cross the line with texture. But texture is more of that thing you kind of can't easily describe a lot of the time. So if you're a composer, arranger, orchestrator, music producer, or a performer, there are some things that you should keep in mind if you want to incorporate uses of texture in your music. For instance, more instruments will likely create a thicker, richer, fuller sound, and fewer instruments might create a sound that is comparatively thin, chilly, brittle, or hollow. The range of the pitches that are performed can greatly impact the texture and color. The full ensemble, depending on what the ensemble is, might sound completely different in certain circumstances. If they're all playing high, it might sound brighter, and if they're all playing low, it might sound darker. As I alluded to earlier, certain instruments can change color and texture pretty drastically sometimes throughout their ranges. A flute sounds mysterious and breathy low in its range, but high in its range, it can be incredibly bright and cheerful and nimble, and even piercing at times. A clarinet, to quote Gordon Jacobs' Orchestral Technique, a manual for students, sounds rich and oily, hollow and rather sinister in its lowest range, and I just love that description. A clarinet sounds bright and piercing at the top of its range, and there's a small range in the middle that a less experienced clarinetist, the sounds there will sound a little bit comparatively muted and lacking some oomph. The bassoon sounds probably most characteristic low in its range, where it can be a little comedic at times, but it's a rich sound. But if you know Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, right from the very beginning, you know how haunting a bassoon can sound at the top of its range. With human voices and range, basically all bets are off. Each voice is unique, and truly each instrument and player is unique as well, but voices, at least in my experience, are even more so. Some are thick and round low in their range, while some are bright and piercing low in their range. Some voices are bright and shining high in their range, while some are thin and floaty high in their range. A good singer can potentially change the color depending on what range it's in to suit the needs that are required by the music. Choosing when to use or highlight specific instruments can change the texture and color of the entire ensemble. The oboe, like I mentioned earlier, typically makes things sound brighter, and adding French horns to a passage can make it sound thicker and richer and fuller. Adding a harp can make things sound more delicate and shimmery, but the loud, low notes in the harp can cut through with a surprisingly powerful attack in the right circumstances. Even the way an instrument is played can greatly change the colors and textures you achieve with it. With strings, you can ask a player or an ensemble to bow on different parts of the strings. The typical bowing location will produce the richest, roundest, cleanest sound, but bowing higher or lower can produce sounds that are more nasal or more brittle, for example. And the string players don't necessarily even have to bow. They can bounce the bow on the strings with the string part of the bow or with the wood part of the bow. This will create a more percussive and wooden sound. Or they can pluck the strings, which can create little points of sound that can sound more sparse or more jagged. Many instruments have mutes that you can add that can muffle the sound. I think the biggest difference is in the large array of different mutes that brass players can use, either specifically manufactured as a mute or improvised, including using your hand as a mute. These mutes can make a brass instrument sound like a completely different instrument in some cases, while string mutes have a much more subtle effect. One simple thing that many people are aware of that can have a huge impact on the texture of the music is the pedals on a piano. The sustain pedal alone is something that can make any texture instantly more wet, and it can easily get muddy if there are enough notes happening on the piano at that time. But I think possibly the biggest contributor. Gosh, this sentence is hard. But I think possibly the biggest contributor to the texture of an ensemble is the percussion when they're present. For instance, cymbals are not just loud. They can also make a texture sound so much more wet. A hi-hat can be played open, so it rings more and is more wet, or it can be played closed, where it has a crisper, drier sound. Other cymbals can be struck and allowed to ring, again making the sound more wet, or choked to suddenly cut off the sound, giving a potentially sharp boundary between textures. Cymbals, along with many other percussion instruments like vibraphone, can even be bowed. This has a similar wet effect to a normal cymbal sound, but it removes much of the sharp attack at the beginning of the sound, and can often add different overtones or highlight different overtones, thus changing the color of the instrument. Speaking of using a bow instead of a typical stick or mallet, the type of stick or mallet you choose on any percussion instrument can have a huge effect on the color and texture. Think of a typical drumstick hitting a cymbal versus a soft yarn mallet hitting a cymbal. Very different sound. Or think of a jazz drummer playing with brushes instead of with sticks that give it a cool, smooth, mellow sound. You can even put things onto a drum to change its sound. A towel will mellow and muffle the sound, or a chain will make it sound more sharp and give it a little extra rattle. But be careful with some of these things because they can damage the instrument if done improperly. I'd suggest if you're working with an experienced drummer or percussionist, you talk with them and tell them the colors and textures that you're going for, that you'd like to achieve. They will likely have some good ideas for what mallets or other playing techniques to use to help you achieve the sound you want. But the texture of the music isn't only up to the performers. The room the music is being performed in can have a huge effect on the sound, and a lot of things can be done with how the music is recorded, edited, mixed, and mastered to change its texture and color. The biggest factor in the room itself will be the reverb. Is the music being performed or recorded in a small room with acoustic panels on the walls, or is it being performed in a large, empty church with stone walls and marble floors? The first of these will sound much drier than the second. In editing, a producer can pan sounds hard to the left or right. This can bring out certain things that you might want to stick out, or it can make things sound off balance, whether unintentionally or intentionally. If a sound moves steadily from being just in one ear to just in the other, it can disorient the listener, or if it rocks between, it can give the listener a rocking effect. There are tons of other recording effects that can be used to change color and texture, and I'm really not the expert in this. This can range from things like effect pedals that the performers themselves would be more in charge of, to effects used on the recording after it has taken place. Even things like the placement of the microphone in the room in regard to where the performer is can make a huge difference in a recording, and you'll have to ask a recording engineer for more information about that. It's fascinating, and there are a lot of things that an experienced engineer has to consider. Hey, are you enjoying this? Please don't forget to give the video a like. Subscribe if you're interested in more discussions like this. I only put out music theory videos like this a few times a year. Usually I stick to reviews of music and video games. If you're only interested in the music theory videos, check out the music theory playlist. Anyway, back to the video. As I mentioned in the review for Fumbling Towards Ecstasy that Remain and I recently made, I think that album is an absolute masterpiece of playing with texture. I wanted to give a full rundown of the texture in one particular song, Plenty. You might want to pause this video now and listen to Plenty, then come back to hear my description. Or maybe listen to parts and then go back and forth. I don't know, whatever works for you. We start with a synth that slowly fades in. This adds a little bit of wetness to the texture, but the bright color of the synth makes it sound more shimmery than wet to me. The next thing we hear is a little rustle on a drum, followed by a sharp drum strike that almost sounds like a gunshot. This puts a big spike in the texture. It wakes you up. More synths layer in, but are still just sticking to a generally shimmery texture. The bass and the drums slowly fade in, and we get our first especially wet texture, a soft cymbal crash. The drummer stays on the cymbals, keeping the texture wet, as Sarah sings her first Plenty. Then there's an abrupt texture shift. The cymbals are choked. The drummer is still playing a hi-hat, but it's now closed. Instead, there's a huge focus on the drums themselves. The texture is now mostly dry, but the shimmery synths are still there, adding a slight wetness. Another cymbal crash and a greater focus on the cymbals in general make the texture wet again, as Sarah starts the first verse. I looked into your eyes. They told me plenty I already knew. We also hear the guitar much more here. Again, for the second line of the verse, the texture quickly dries up, just as it did seconds ago. The guitar also mostly stops. We just hear the occasional chord ringing out. Notably, the synths also stop. We mostly hear the dry drumming, the bass, and Sarah's voice. She sings here the line, "You never felt a thing. So soon forgotten all that you do." Now moving on to the pre-chorus, where Sarah's voice leaps higher than it has been. It sounds more emotional as she sings the words, "In more than words, I tried to tell you. The more I tried, I failed." You'll likely notice that the texture is also wetter during this pre-chorus, in the same way we've been going back and forth. The next new section of the song is the chorus. The words here are, "I would not let myself believe that you might stray, and I would stand by you no matter what they'd say. I would. I thought I'd be with you until my dying day." The texture stays wet for this section, but Sarah's voice has moved down from its higher, more clearly emotional register to the lower register of the verses. The notable differences from the verses, though, are the major key and the half-time tempo. So just looking at the intro, first verse, first pre-chorus, and first chorus, what does it all mean, and how does texture help explain the situation? The way I read it, Sarah is processing the end of a relationship. She knew the end was coming, she said so in the second line, but the look in her former partner's eyes confirmed what she was already expecting. While she's saying these lines, the texture is wet. The texture is portraying how she feels about the situation. When the lyrics turn to talking about her partner, "You never felt a thing, so soon forgotten all that you do," the texture is dry and much less emotional. The partner feels nothing, and the dry texture is highlighting Sarah's words. The pre-chorus focuses on Sarah again and how she feels. Therefore, the texture is wet. She's trying to reach out, and her vocal line climbs. Her reaching fails, and the line falls back to the low register. The chorus is still wet, and we're still talking about how Sarah feels. The chorus is in a major key because Sarah is now singing about the positive side that she had been experiencing before she started to see the cracks forming in the relationship. The half-time feel of the chorus suggests to me a wistful dreamscape almost. She's remembering how she felt then, and it's detached from how she feels now. In the transition back to the verses, we move again to a minor key and hear another gunshot-like drum strike. Based on what we know of the song now, I think the gunshot symbolizes the breaking point in the relationship. We hear the gunshot again, and it's almost like Sarah is remembering how the relationship ended, bringing us to the second verse. Instead of going point by point through the second half of the song, I think I can just point out what's different the second time through. In the second verse, the dry texture comes first, not the wet. Here, she's singing about her life feeling empty. In the second half of the verse, the texture is wet for "You hurt me more than I ever could have imagined." Her voice also climbs higher here, emphasizing that hurt. In the second pre-chorus, Sarah finds freedom in the current stillness. This pre-chorus has both wet and dry textures. To me, this suggests that freedom that Sarah had found is helping her move past the anguish she was feeling because of the breakup. For the second chorus, the music does not move into that halftime feel that we had in the first chorus. We still have the wet texture, so it's still emotional, but the lack of halftime suggests to me that Sarah is more accepting of this past and more accepting of her pain, which is helping her move through it. I think that might be all thanks to the freedom that she was feeling. The very end of this chorus does move into that halftime feel again to suggest that there's still some work to do, but Sarah has definitely made progress. I hope that analysis helped you see what texture can do for a piece of music. I don't think most songwriters and producers think of it quite like this. Plenty is definitely a complicated example, and there's nothing wrong with songs that have a simpler take on texture. I just think that this is something cool that you can do if you want to go that route. I hope you enjoyed my brief primer on the concept of texture. Give this video a like if you liked it. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions about texture, or if there are any songs you know of that play with texture in a really creative and satisfying way. I'd love to listen to them. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into music. These theory videos, like I said before, aren't really the focus of the channel, but I love to include them when they are related to music that we're already discussing. We also discuss and review video games and a little bit of TV and movies. Up here is another video that YouTube thinks you might like, so check that out. Down here is a playlist of music theory videos, so if you want more of that, it's right there. That should be about it. Maintain your groovy selves.